Hey, special educators. Welcome to Teach, Taskbox, Inspire, the podcast dedicated to making your job as a special education teacher easier by making your instruction more fun for you and your students. Inside each episode, you'll learn how to get the most use out of your task boxes in the classroom. I'm your host, Lisa Holliday from Chalkboard Superhero, a veteran special education teacher passionate about empowering you with purposeful teaching strategies, helpful tips and tricks, and other classroom management tools that will help you thrive in your role. Let's get started with today's episode. Hey there, special education teachers, and welcome back to another episode of Teach, Taskbox, Inspire. I'm your host, Lisa Holliday, and today we're diving into a topic that's so essential when working with autistic students: teaching flexibility and reducing that rigid thinking. So whether you're in the classroom or at home, these skills are vital in helping students navigate a world that can feel so unpredictable. In my experience as a special education teacher, I've learned that many of my students thrive on consistency, routine, and predictability. But the world doesn't always operate on that same level of routine. And it's our job to help our students adapt to those inevitable changes, right? So today I want to share 5 tips and strategies on how to support flexibility in our classrooms and how we can balance kind of honoring routines with encouraging growth, kind of stretching our students out. So first and foremost, is this really something that needs to change? We all have our routines, and consistency provides so much comfort, even as neurotypical people, adults. So imagine you had no set work schedule and you were told each day at random whether or not you'd need to come in. That would create a lot of anxiety and stress. Similarly, our students need structure, but sometimes the routines they can create and become too rigid can interfere with daily life. So in my classroom, I've seen many students become very attached to certain routines. Whether it's sitting in the same spot on the carpet or sitting in the same chair. One time I had a girl who liked this papasan chair, and she only would sit in that. She would bring it everywhere with her. She would drag it all around. Or, for example, using the same pencil for all activities. Initially, you kind of honor these needs because you don't want to kind of add to their stress. But if you had a student who would only use a specific chair during circle time, if someone else was in that chair, that would trigger a meltdown. So after time, you have to realize that by honoring all of these rigid preferences, you're actually reinforcing that anxiety around them. For example, what happens when that chair is unavailable or it's in a different classroom setting? This happened because that same girl I was just talking about is that papasan chair ended up breaking. Now, I couldn't get another one for the rest of the day, and I certainly couldn't get one until I ordered a new one on Amazon. However, that triggered like the ultimate meltdown for this girl, where she eventually had to get picked up because she just could not cope with that. The more we allow rigid routines to kind of take control of the students, the harder it is to teach flexibility, which is ultimately a life skill that they absolutely need. If there's a preference that doesn't negatively impact their life or learning, I always ask myself, do we really need to change this? For example, if a student prefers to always use blue markers for their work and it doesn't hinder their classroom process, then whatever, it's okay to allow that kind of consistency. But if this behavior is causing stress, like needing to use a certain item that's no longer available, we kind of need to address that rigidity. For example, I had a student in my last placement who absolutely had to do all of his work using crayons in rainbow order. And it actually wasn't like the true rainbow order. It was the rainbow order that was in his head. And so, for example, if he couldn't find a specific blue, this child would have a complete meltdown. Now, again, he was 5, so there was a lot of learning there. But by the time we get to high school, we need to have these students learn a lot more flexibility before they exit high school. All right, number 2, understanding the underlying cause. Now, once you've kind of identified a rigidity that may need addressing, the next step is to kind of understand why it exists. This is so essential to kind of approach these behaviors with empathy and really investigate why. Ask yourself, is it sensory based? Is it related to anxiety? Do they feel out of control? One of my students in my class always insisted on wearing the same sweatshirt every single day. After careful observation, I realized it wasn't really about the sweatshirt itself. It was the sensory input, the comfort that it provided. It was a soft, tag-free sweatshirt. It felt really nicely on his body. This understanding helped me tailor my approach. So instead of forcing, him to change it right away, we explored different clothing options that provided that same sensory input that sweatshirt gave him. So after that, we could introduce some variety and to get him to kind of self-advocate, like why he likes the same hoodie and why we don't always want to wear the same clothes and that we have to wash some things sometimes, right? So when addressing this rigidity, it's key to make sure there's not any like medical issues or sensory issues that are really driving that behavior, because sometimes students with autism also experience anxiety disorders or other sensory processing issues, which can kind of overlap with their need for routines. So understanding the why is the first step toward teaching them flexibility in a very supportive way. Number 3 is proactively teaching flexibility. So you might be thinking, okay, Lisa, how do we teach it? Really, there are so many ways, and it's all about making a change in an expected part of life. So one of the best strategies I found is modeling flexibility in my own actions. So for example, if a student's favorite center is closed or a favorite item is unavailable, I will show them, I'll model a behavior. I demonstrate calmly adjusting to the change. I might say, oh man, I was really hoping to use this, but I guess I'll try something else today. And I might even have a visual that goes along with that phrase or expectation. Modeling this calm adaptability goes a long way in showing students how to do that. Also, you could always videotape yourself doing this so that they have a visual model of how to have that metacognition of thinking about their own thoughts and how to be flexible. Another effective strategy is I use planned sabotage. Now, I know if you're a special education teacher for a long time, you've heard this before, but this is a purposeful way of introducing kind of small changes that allow students to kind of practice that flexibility in a controlled and supportive environment. For example, if I know a student always expects to sit at the same table, I might rotate where they sit one day and help them process that change. Another example is that girl who always sat in that chair in the same spot at the same table. I would kind of come in the morning and move that chair to a different table. Or I might have a student start sitting there and have them get up when the student asks them. But you want to start slow. You can't just say, oh, no, sorry, you're not having this chair all day. Maybe they give up the chair for 1 minute. It's all going to depend on how much you can stretch that student. Starting with small variations can slowly build their ability to handle bigger changes later. All right, number 4 is using visual supports for change. Now, I can list in my show notes a ton of different visual aids that you can find in my TPT store, but these are absolutely a game changer when teaching flexibility. Many of my students with autism thrive on visual schedules because it gives them a sense of security. But I also like to use visual cues to kind of prepare them for changes. For instance, if you know there's going to be a fire drill or a change in the regular schedule, I show them a picture or add it to our daily schedule. I found that using these visuals to indicate that something is going to be different or something's going to change can significantly reduce the anxiety that comes with the unknown. I also use timers to help with those transitions. If a student struggles to move from one activity to the next, I'll set a timer and let them know that when the timer goes off, we'll be moving to the next task. This creates a clear visual representation of change, allowing them to anticipate and adjust without feeling blindsided. And the last one I want you to kind of use to teach that flexibility is through play, especially when you have young kids. So structured games with changing rules can encourage students to adjust to new situations while still having fun. So for example, if you're playing a familiar game like, Duck, Duck, Goose, you can add a new rule. Okay, after 3 rounds, the rules change, or the sitting circle moves positions. So games like this gently kind of push students to adapt while keeping the activity enjoyable. Similarly, you could use a puzzle or building block activity where each round you swap colors or shapes and kind of teach them to make small adjustments in their expectations. Now, this isn't going to be easy because if you have kids who are very used to their rigidity, you are going to see them, building with only the square blocks. And you might, pick up a round block and say, oh, does this go up on top? And they might have a meltdown. So go slow, go very, very slow, because especially if they're younger, if they're 3, 4, and 5 years old, they are learning a lot of different things right now, let alone stretching them to be a little bit more flexible. However, if you have a student in high school and you're playing a game of Uno and you change the rules just slightly, see if they'll take that change and get a little bit more flexible. So incorporating flexibility into play allows students to kind of practice these life skills in a low pressure, kind of engaging way. It really is amazing how quickly they learn when they're already enjoying themselves. So there you have it, guys. 5 strategies to help support flexibility and reduce that rigid thinking in our autistic students. Remember, it's not about kind of forcing change on our students, but providing them with tools and opportunities to build that skill at their own pace. It's going to be a process, but with patience, empathy, and some strategic planning, we can really help them grow in ways that truly make a difference. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Until next time, bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Teach, Taskbox, Inspire. I hope you've gained some tips and motivation to fuel your week ahead. If you're ready to explore more strategies for empowering your students as independent learners, be sure to dive into my free training at chalkboardsuperhero.com/training. And don't keep all this knowledge to yourself. Share this episode with your special education teacher friends who could use some motivation and inspiration. One more thing before you go. If you're finding this podcast helpful and want to show support, head to Apple Podcasts and leave your rating and review. Until next time, keep teaching, taskboxing, and inspiring.